Welcome to the Global Journalism Seminars. This is The Briefing. There are many parallels between the work of soldiers, journalists, and activists. Commitment to a cause, exposure to risk and danger, adherence to ethical standards, encountering trauma. But while a lot of work has gone into understanding the emotional toll of being in the military, comparatively little attention is paid to the effect of the work of other frontline responders. When we polled our journalists to ask if they had ever felt a level of pressure in work that they would class as distress, 75% said yes. When we asked which of three options might be the most likely predictor of psychological distress in frontline journalists, 6.3% chose gender, 25% said strength of familial bonds, and 69% said previous mental health problems. Professor of Psychiatry Dr. Anthony Feinstein has been studying journalists who cover conflict zones for years, and his work defining moral injury has sparked a conversation about conscientious employment practices. He's joined today by Dulce Romero, a journalist from Colombia who was on the verge of quitting until she found solutions journalism and peace journalism, two relatively new approaches to her work that helped temper the hopeless narratives surrounding cartels, narco-terrorism, and corruption. In this seminar, we'll talk to both about the predictors of psychological distress and whether there are better ways to work that might mitigate those risks. That's The Briefing. Let's begin. Hello and welcome back to the Global Journalism Seminars. I am Caitlin Mercer, and a special welcome to the Thomson Reuters changemakers who are joining our fellows in the audience today. We'll come back to them for questions in a bit, but first allow me to introduce Dr. Anthony Feinstein, Professor of Psychiatry at Sunnybrook in Toronto. Welcome, Anthony.
Thank you.
As well as Colombian journalist and Peace Fellow Dulce Romero. Bienvenida de nuevo, amiga.
Well, pronunciation, right? Thank you so much. Thank you for having me here.
Forgive my pronunciation. We're discussing the topic of distress in frontline journalists at an incredibly critical time. But I want to start by saying neither of you is a politician or a Middle East expert, but you are both well-versed in human suffering and our response to it. So let's dig in. It's probably worth defining some terminology as we set out on this conversation. So Anthony, your paper is titled Predictors of Distress in Frontline Journalists. What is distress? How does it differ from trauma? What is PTSD? And how does it differ from moral injury?
Yeah, all right, great questions. Thank you. So let's just start off with trauma. So a very simple definition of trauma is it's a deeply distressing or disturbing personal experience. It's a very broad definition. That's very common in our lives. Nobody's going to go through a long life without experiencing some element of trauma as defined by this. This, however, is quantifiably different from post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a full-blown mental illness with very clear diagnostic criteria, which I'll just quickly summarize for you. So to develop PTSD, you have to have been exposed to a stressor of overwhelming magnitude, something that could have killed you or killed other people. And then your symptoms fall into four broad categories. You re-experience the trauma through flashbacks, nightmares, unwanted recollections. There's avoidant behavior where you want to stay away from recollections of the trauma, or you try and distract yourself from memories of it. Then the third component is your body's autonomic nervous system becomes hyper-aroused, so you can't fall asleep, you can't concentrate, you have a prominent startle response, you're hypervigilant. And the fourth symptom group is that you have a negative view of the world, anticipating future misfortune. And things that you enjoyed in the past take on a negative connotation. So to diagnose PTSD, you've got to have symptoms from all four groups. So you can see the bar is set very high. That's a mental illness. Moral injury, the third thing that you raised, is not a mental illness. But moral injury can cause a lot of distress. And the definition that I like for moral injury is it's a condition that can arise by witnessing, perpetrating, or failing to prevent acts that transgress your own moral compass. So the definition is important because it's things that you can do, you can perpetrate or witness, or things that you fail to do, acts of omission that can trigger moral injury. And moral injury is associated with emotions like guilt and shame, and in journalists, anger. Now, moral injury is not a mental illness, and I hope it never becomes one, but it's a significant condition, as you can hear from these emotions of guilt, shame, and anger. It often coexists with post-traumatic stress disorder, and it might be the conduit to PTSD and depression and other mental illnesses. So I'm glad that we got these definitions out the way, because there's a lot of confusion about what these conditions are.
Yeah. So probably a lot of us are experiencing a certain amount of moral injury at the moment. I'm just going to forgive the intrusion. Just from a technical standpoint, can I say to the people downstairs who say they can't hear and the sound is coming out of the laptop, please go to the speaker in Zoom, click on the arrow next to the speaker, and change from select speaker Realtek to select speaker echo cancelling, and the sound should be fixed. Okay, so back to trauma and moral injury. There's a degree of moral injury that we experience with the technology in this building. Sorry, not a topic to joke about, but Anthony, we were talking about the article by Daniel Carr in New York Magazine describing that trauma has become an inflationary currency, and sort of criticizing some of the narrative that's come about after the work of Bessel van der Kolk on Body Keeps the Score. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's a fair assessment on Danielle's part?
I think that there's certainly elements there that need to be taken very seriously, because, I've defined trauma for you, which is very common, but trauma is not synonymous with PTSD. There's an enormous gulf between them. Lots of people can have traumatic experiences, and the majority will not develop PTSD. So the moment, someone goes through a traumatic event and then glibly says, "Oh, well, I've got PTSD because I experienced trauma," that basically conflates two issues, and it kind of muddies the waters, and then you start having a very confused narrative. I mean, to put PTSD into perspective, the lifetime prevalence in the general population, North American data is going to be 5, 6, 7%, slightly higher in women than in men. But no individual is going to go through life without experiencing some kind of traumatic experience. That's just the nature of our existence. So, 100% of us do not have PTSD. So we really have to be very clear about the definitions.
Yeah. On continuing on our definition train, Laura, we're going to talk about solutions journalism and we're going to talk about peace journalism. Can I ask you to give us a brief definition of both of those?
Yes, now we are changing the subject radically, but I swear we are going to link them, So I will say about solutions journalism, let's start with that. It's a rigorous and evidence-based reporting about the response to social problems. It sounds very, very broad, but in concrete, in simple words, it's when journalists investigate and explain solutions that people or communities or organizations have developed and implemented to solve their problems. Traditional journalists often, define news as what goes wrong or what doesn't work. Solution journalism leads an effort to balance the news agenda, which we know it's extremely negative, and show the responses that are also newsworthy. There are journalists who are dedicated only on reporting these kind of stories, but the truth is that SOYO, as we call it, is a tool on the journalist box. But let's talk about that later. And about peace journalism, I will call it journalism that emphasizes impossibilities, and I like how the promoters describe it, it gives peace a chance. And basically it's when editors and reporters make decisions about what to report and how to report, with the intention of highlighting non-violent responses to the conflict to their audiences. Was originally conceived by the Norwegian sociologist Johan Galtung. This is very theoretical, I know, I'm sorry. And he's the father of the peace studies, the father of the peace studies. And for me, what is important about peace journalism is that offers a new roadmap that enables journalists to, frame stories, be careful with the words they use, create an atmosphere conducive to peace, and be very supportive of peace initiative and peacemakers without compromising, the basic principles of journalism.
Okay, let's dive into this deeper in a bit. But before we do that, my burning question for you, Anthony, and your paper addresses it to a degree. We know that you can send 2 journalists to the front line, and they will be reporting on the same story, and one will come back really badly affected by what they've seen, and the other will not. Do we know why?
we've got clues as to why that might be. And I think the paper that you refer to is the one that we published recently, looking at our very large database of over 1,000 frontline journalists who had been covering conflict in the Balkans, Mexico, Kenya, Iran, Syria, Afghanistan, Israel. And we basically mined this data to see, could we find predictors of psychological distress in this group, and what are the protective factors? Now, these are many countries, very different cultures, different languages, and so you have to be careful when you're comparing apples with oranges, etc. But there are statistical tools that allow you to extract data from a complex and varied database like this. And what we did was we said, okay, you can't compare Afghanistan to Syria to Mexico, but what we can do is we can go into each country and have a look. What are the risk factors in each country, and what are the protective factors in each country? And then we can compare those across all these different countries, which is what we did. And we found some very simple variables that emerged. The risk factors are, if you're a woman, you're going to be more likely to have symptoms of PTSD. And we can talk about this now. If you come with a past psychiatric history, in other words, if you have a history of mental illness before you start doing this work, potentially you are more vulnerable. But the biggest protective factor across all these databases, across 11 different countries, 11 different databases, across different cultures, languages, the biggest protective factor is a good relationship. Relationships help our mental health. They are buffers to mental distress. And it doesn't matter where you are, if you've got a good relationship that you come home to at the end of a long day at the office or a difficult day reporting on trauma, this is protective to your mental well-being. And why I like this result, it meshes very well with the broad psychiatric literature across multiple cultures. You know, we are social animals. We want to interact with people in a positive, healthy way. And if you've got good social relationships, a good marriage, a good relationship with your partner, your spouse, etc., it's a very, very strong protective factor in terms of your mental health. So those are some clues that emerged from this big database. There are going to be many other reasons why some person succumbs and another person doesn't, related to genetics, their upbringing, etc., which we didn't have the methodology to explore.
So this is incredibly bad news for a single female journalist with an anxiety disorder. Laura, how do you feel hearing this? Does it chime with your lived experience?
Well, maybe I would have taken precautions before because the Laura of 3 years ago had all the 3 elements. Not anymore, but you know what I mean. Yeah, I mean, it would be great if you have this information as a journalist when you start covering these difficult, topics. I actually, when I was thinking to respond these questions, I was remembering when I started feeling all the signals and how I was not aware what was happening to me, like how my body, sent me a lot of signals and I didn't read them because I didn't know about it. And actually, we talked to my work colleagues last week and we said like, hey, unbelievable how we dreamt so many violent things. We felt so bad, so hopeless, even felt very sick, like physically sick, and how we were so cynical and so skeptical. And we didn't see that coming, or in my case, I didn't see that coming because later I had, anxiety crisis, etc. And I didn't connect what happened. I mean, I wouldn't say that it's like we are the, like shame on us because we are women, single, or with previous problems with mental health. I just think that it's an alert for us, and before we start covering this kind of topics, we should be aware of that. And that's simple. I mean, we can do it as other people do, but we have to take precautions, and also the newsrooms, have to take precautions about it.
Yeah. Would you say there's been there seems to be more awareness in newsrooms about this now. Would you say that there's been something of a shift, or is it generational? Is it broadly accepted, or do you feel like?
I mean, I think that as is happening in the rest of the world, now there is a greater awareness of the importance of the mental health in newsrooms. And I absolutely agree with you that it's also thanks to the generational change, right? Like these new generations have shown to the previous generation that it's not about being crybabies or glass generation, as they call us all the time, and that letting go of what we experience will only, have a repercussions in our personal life and our mental and physical health. But we have a long way to go. I mean, I remember when during the COVID, when we slowed a bit down, I remember that our symptoms, they felt stronger, and we asked in the newsroom like for help, and the answer was to ask for an appointment with a coach that they are. And I now that I remember it, it's like, hey, maybe we were covering very bad stuff and a lot of suffering, and maybe we didn't need a coach. We need a professional, to look for us. And also, I must confess that I didn't say very loud that I needed help. And I think it's because inside me there was a fear of being singled out as a weak, as a bad reporter, because in journalism it's very normalized to endure long hours, listen to very painful stories, be ready for everything, and in a very, precarious conditions, usually poorly paid. Well, you already know that. And I felt that I could fake that mentality, and especially as a woman, I was even more afraid of such a finger pointing. So I don't think it's something that we made up, and this fear comes from what is taught in the university, the comments inside the newsroom, and that's why I think there's a lot of still work to be done. And the progress that I have investigated or seen, it's in the biggest newsrooms, right? And with financial supporting. But I wonder, for example, what happens with the more local newsrooms that cannot afford such an expense, right? I think there's a lack of protocols inside newsrooms, the space for checking the journalists, opportunities to call a psychologist, for example, especially for those who are super exposed to conflict and violence scenarios. So, and also even now that we are having this discussion, I think like there's no communication with people like the Professor Anthony who are researching about these preventing factors. It would be very important, because ideally journalists shouldn't get to anxiety, stress, depression. No, newsrooms should be able to anticipate it and talk about it.
What's your response to that, Anthony?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Laura said some really good points. My take on the situation is that, because I've been doing it now for 23 years, is I've seen an evolution. When we first did our original study, there wasn't a discussion about it at all. Just nothing. It was a complete void. In Western news organizations in the United Kingdom, Canada, parts of the United States, there's now a discussion about it. It's become very important. I think the pandemic certainly gave impetus to this. And by the way, we did a study during the pandemic where we showed very clearly that if you put therapy in place, the journalists who get therapy do better than the journalists who don't. So we've got that's an important observation. However, when you go to great parts of this world, Kenya, Afghanistan, Syria, Mexico, there's no discussion about this. And the journalists are not getting the kind of help that they should be getting. So great swathes of this world outside of, the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, this is not a topic that's being discussed. It's journalists are doing very difficult work, arguably the most difficult work, and they don't have any kind of recognition of the topic that we're talking about today. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, that does seem to be the weird cruelty of life, is the place where the solutions are discussed is not usually the place where the problems are happening.
And what's interesting is that the kind of variables that leave us vulnerable or which are protective are universal. We're all the same. We all want the same thing.
Yeah, incredibly universal. Can I ask a question about the finding that that women were more likely to be vulnerable? Do you think there's any possibility that the data might have been skewed because women perhaps felt freer to report distress in a survey or in whatever form?
Yeah. Once again, a great point. If you go into the general population, so just ignore journalism, look at the broader population. Once again, you see higher levels of PTSD in women than in men. You see higher levels of depression and anxiety in women than in men. You see higher levels of substance abuse in men rather than women. So you get these, these sex differences in presentations. And the question is why? And you just touched on something which people have spoken about. Maybe women feel more freer about divulging their emotions than men. But I think it's much more complex than that. I think in terms of conflict, one of the big factors that can explain why women have higher rates of PTSD symptoms is they're more vulnerable to sexual assault. That's not to say that men don't get assaulted sexually, but certainly the rates are higher in women, and I think that really pushes up the the numbers.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
I've got. I'm not sure where to go from there. Sorry.
Well, I just think women are more vulnerable in dangerous situations.
Yeah, it's devastating. I think you just took my breath away. I didn't put two and two together in that way. Laura, let's just talk a little bit about the practical approaches to perhaps mitigating some of this distress. And we must say that this is not scientific. This is just from lived experience. And perhaps, Anthony, you can do some more studies on this topic. But we have a sense, you and I, that perhaps new formats like solutions journalism and peace journalism could offer a place of less moral injury. So do you want to tell us a little bit about what would go into doing a solutions journalism story that makes it different from doing it straight?
Well, if you want, I can explain like how works solution journalism and peace journalism.
Same as well. Yeah.
So in the case of the solution journalism, I saw it like an exit for me to stop like the intoxication that I had, even as a journalist, because people think like only the audiences, have intoxication, but actually it happens to us. No, we get, sick and I'm very overwhelmed about the amount of information. I'm very, very, a lot of suffering behind it. So yeah, let's start with Soyo. I think the Solution Journalism Network of the organization behind this approach has insisted that solution journalism cannot be seen just as a positive news content, like this rosy world. And for that, they have mentioned 4 pillars. The first one is like the response. So what we do is features not just a person or organization. We try to report about the response to a problem and how it happened. Also, we try to seek to provide insights that can help others respond. It's not just an inspirational thing. We try to seek also for evidence. It means data and qualitative results, looking at effectiveness, not just good intentions. Also, we know and we are very aware that there's no solution, perfect solution. So it's necessary to show what is missing or what needs to be improved in the solutions. I recorded a podcast during my fellowship in Oxford, and the way I tried to explain it was with the whole story. Promoters of the solution journalism always talk about the whole story. What does it mean? The W, what the response is addressed, the H, how it works, the O, the offers insights, the L includes limitation, and E, most important, provides evidence of the impact. It's a very, it's a better way to remember it, because it's in the beginning it can be a bit complicated. And in peace journalism, I think peace journalism can be summarized in 17 points that the promoters have already written, and they are super clear. I'm not gonna say all of them right now because of the time, but basically peace journalism is very proactive. We try to examine the causes of the conflict and lead the discussion about the solutions to know. We are very focused on the initiative, peace initiative, not just the consequences, the bad consequences of the war. We also provide a lot of depth and context rather than just superficial and civilizational, like blow-by-blow accounts of violence and conflict. And for this, we try to see, for example, the structural, the cultural, and the direct types of violence. Also, peace journalism try to avoid this narrative of us versus them, the good guy and the bad guy, that now I think you can see it in the conflict with Israel and Palestine. On the contrary, we try to humanize the people involved in the conflict. Also, we run away from propaganda, and instead we try to see the facts from all sources. We try to balance covering the issues, the suffering, the peace proposals from all sides of the conflict. And for me, that also it's important to mention that we try to, be aware of the consequences of our reporting. And perhaps that is also why we run away from breaking news.
So Laura, let me ask you, I'm so sorry. Can I ask you, because you caught my attention with that sentence, if you were covering Gaza now with peace journalism, how would you be approaching your coverage? Sorry, that's a huge question, but
like these hypothetical situations are very difficult, aren't they? Like, because in the end, these journalists, they are doing the best they can with the best they have, and I'm here in my comfortable, home, and they are trying to save their lives and protect their families. So it's very, very difficult questions. Actually, yesterday I wrote to a colleague who is in Israel, and she told me, of course, she was fine, but also she was feeling very, well and emotionally broken. And I told her that maybe peace journalism could help her, to make a space of care. And of course, people will say to me right now, hey, are you talking about peace in the middle of the war? And yes, I think so. And for example, in the case of Colombia, we live both realities. We are in conflict and post-conflict area at the same time. So I think that you have to cover what is happening in terms of injuries, in terms of events, but also my advice would be like, try to, see what people are doing to survive and promote peace. And peace is all those situations where one chooses the path of non-violence. There's a lot of the stories of solidarity, support, help that are also worth telling. And this is what we mean when we talk about peace initiative, where there are a lot of groups, organizations that are advocating for dialogue, for ceasefires, for opening spaces. They offer humanitarian aid. So I think these people must be given a speaker to raise their voice, and also this also has to move away from this extreme and warlike discourses that now we see and are the justification in the midst of the violence. I think it's important that as a peace journalist, if you are there, try to give context, create explanatory formats for concepts. I can see how a lot of concepts like genocide, occupation, Zionism, terrorism are around social media, and there's no one. I mean, not there's no one, but a few media outlets are explaining what that means. What do they mean? And I think it's important also come back to the history. It sounds a bit boring, but let's call to the newsrooms and let's call to action to the newsrooms and be creative and split task. And this is not a conflict that appear out of nowhere, and journalists must be explain this kind of stuff, and explain what happened during the 7 decades that it's been going on, this war. So yes, I will call to that. And also what else? And
that's perfect. That's perfect. Let me ask the same question of Anthony. Again, we're not trying to trivialize the situation. There are clearly no easy answers for those covering this conflict, although I really love those practical steps, Laura. Anthony, could you weigh in on practical steps for dealing with the weight of being exposed to this level of violence, both on the ground and increasingly even at a distance, because you're seeing such graphic imagery?
Yeah. So I think the first principle is you've got to be physically safe as much as you can. You can't make war safe, but if you're going to report war, then you have to have the right protective equipment. I think you have to start with that. Then from a psychiatric or psychological perspective, journalists need to be educated about what the risks are. They need to understand, what are conditions like PTSD and moral injury. It was really striking for me that when I first started to do this research 20 plus years back, and I was interviewing really smart and well-educated people, there was a tremendous naivety about trauma and what the mental consequences of stress were. So I think psychoeducation becomes absolutely pivotal. And the kind of sessions that we're having now are key to it. You want to educate people about what happens when you confront traumatic, difficult situations. When you're in the midst of it, obviously you want to keep yourself safe, and then just self-monitor. to do self-checks. Be aware of your own feelings. Be aware of how your colleagues are responding as well. There can be a great esprit de corps amongst frontline journalists, that they can support one another and provide, moral and emotional support to one another, which is very important. But in the midst of all of this, the newsroom has to be acutely aware that if you want good journalism, you need healthy journalists. And so they need to be checking in on the journalists on the front line, asking them from time to time, how are you doing? Because if you've got a journalist who's on the front line is not doing well, and their reporting is being biased or compromised by their poor emotional health, you're going to end up with journalism that's compromised. And a very important point to make is that when people develop mental health symptoms and they have to make important judgment calls, their judgment is going to be biased. Their judgment will be impaired because of their trauma. And that places them at risk, and it places their colleagues at risk as well. So it's a situation that you have to monitor very carefully, very carefully.
Yeah.
You can't send people into the world's most dangerous places and just assume that everything is going to be okay, because it's not.
Yeah.
The majority of journalists will manage it well, but there's going to be this core, this minority who will struggle with this. And you have to be sensitive to that. You have to be able to pick up who are these individuals and how can we help them.
There's actually a question for you here that's very closely related. Before I get to it, can I just ask Matt to share in the chat the link both to Anthony's paper and a link to Laura's podcast on solutions journalism. But an anonymous attendee has asked, moral injury appears then to be an occupational hazard, so who should take responsibility? Shouldn't there be more pressure on organizations to not put people in these positions?
Well, I think it's a good point. The news organizations have come to terms, the big ones in the West have come to terms with post-traumatic stress disorder, I think, because there's been a discussion about this now for 20 plus years. Moral injury is a much newer concept for them. It's not new to the trauma community. It's not new to my community, but it's new to journalism. Moral injury has been around in the military for a long time, going all the way back to, war in Iraq in 2003, Vietnam, etc. But journalism has been much slower on the uptake. And whoever asked the question, you're quite right. Journalists are at the cutting edge of so many things. And when you confront these very difficult, very stressful situations that are so prevalent in our world right now, the potential for moral injury is very high. Now, I don't want to pathologize it. I'll come back to what I said earlier. Moral injury is not a mental illness, but it's a condition that can cause a lot of distress. And it can cause journalists to start altering their behavior. It can make you more cynical. It can chase you away from journalism. It can lead to things like depression and substance abuse, etc. So there needs to be a discussion about moral injury. And what is your role as a journalist? How do I respond when I confront morally egregious situations?
Yeah.
If there's no discussion about it beforehand and one of these situations arise, you have no time to think about it. You have to respond very, very quickly. And you might respond in a way that's later gauged to be incorrect. And then you second guess yourself. In retrospect, you think, well, why did I do this? Or why didn't I do this? And that opens the door to moral injury. Acts of commission, but acts of omission. Why did I not do something?
Yeah.
And that becomes the conduit of moral injury. Yeah.
I'm going to go downstairs. I'm going to come to you now, Laura, and I'm going to go downstairs to Christina to ask a question live in a second. But Laura, you were going to say...
No. I think these moral injuries also, we are talking about the people who are in frontline, right? The journalism frontline, but it happens to, all the sections in the newsrooms, right? The ones who, cover local news, they also have moral injuries, right? And it's the discussion that we have to open it, right? Not just for us. We are, covering post-conflict and conflict areas. It's for all of us.
Yeah. Anyone sitting looking at Chartbeat the last 2 weeks, go give them a hug, because my God. Nedu from Nigeria says, other than the experiences in the field triggering distress, can low wages contribute to distress and depression? Really
good question. Again, the study that we did on journalists covering the migration crisis in Europe a few years back, 2016-17, that's when our data started to show that moral injury was a big issue for journalists. And one of the factors that seemed to be adding to the challenge was lack of resources, that journalists were being asked to work excessively long hours. News organizations were cutting back on resources. There were less resources. You talk about the wages being insufficient. Those are stressors, absolutely. And when you're being asked to do very difficult, emotionally very difficult work, but you're not being given the right kind of resources for it, the right kind of support, the right kind of financial ability to manage these things, absolutely this contributes to your distress.
I like Laura was saying the other day, if journalism is a cornerstone of democracy, then is the state not responsible for ensuring that support is available and people are protected? Did I say that correctly, Laura? Is that?
Yes, actually, we were discussing because we were having the discussion about the people who are hired by an outlet media. What, for example, what happens with the freelancers? No, that was the question mark. And then I told you that we sometimes discuss this with other journalists. Like, let me put it in this way: in this society, there's a lot of professions that are inherent, right? Like doctors, like lawyers, and I think journalism is also one of them, right? And as Anthony said before, like the New York Times has the support to give this support to the journalists, but another local newsroom doesn't have the means to support itself, and maybe needs a help from the state or the freelancers who are so unprotected because the media who hire them don't stand up for them contractually, although they should. And of course, maybe it sounds a little bit crazy for people, but there are, other sectors like the economy, for example, that receive such a support, because it is in the state's interest that there is a prosperity. So my question is, why then is the state not interested in journalism that has the proper guarantees and support to report? I mean, the fact is that information is now a human right and it should be guaranteed. And that's why we putting to the table this discussion now.
What do you say to that, Anthony?
In an ideal world, I absolutely support Laura, but the world's not ideal. And there are many, many governments who will never support journalism, just the opposite. They work actively to undermine journalism. And that becomes a source of moral injury. Just look at the world we are now. How many governments are standing up, wanting to support a free, vibrant press, even in so-called democratic countries? You've got, big name politicians who are targeting journalists, who are trying to undermine the integrity of the media. So, Laura, I'm with you in principle, but I think in practice, we're very far away from that.
Yeah, that's true. No, Anna, I completely agree with you. I mean, I'm just dreaming here, like it should be like that. And also, the other condition that it has been and should be is like the independence of the media should be respected. Also, if you support this newsroom that I'm talking about, but of course, that doesn't happen too. So
maybe in Finland.
Maybe
so can we turn on the camera downstairs and see? Oh, great. Christina, you had a question. And you're still on mute, so not to worry, everybody breathe. And it looks like the camera hasn't turned on. So what I would just suggest is that you hit the orange video conference button, which should trigger the camera to turn on, the big pink little button. And we'll come back to the room in a second. While they get that sorted out, I'm going to ask you a question. Anthony, somebody's asked, would they be able to access a preprint of your paper anywhere?
Sure, the answer is yes. I mean, you've got the paper, Caitlin, so feel free just to
distribute. Is that okay?
Absolutely, yeah, of course. Yeah.
Great. Anonymous attendee, just drop us an email at the Institute and we'll send you a copy. And a question from an Ethiopian journalist who's in exile due to conflict there. Ethiopia is a multi-ethnic society, and when conflicts arise based on identity, many problems can emerge. Journalists are often perceived as taking sides in ethnic communities they claim to be a part of. They become emotionally involved, particularly those from minority groups. How do you find a balance between journalism, advocacy, and activism in such a situation? Laura, that might be a question for you, and Anthony, maybe you want to weigh in?
Yes, of course. It's very hard. I'm always in this debate, in the middle of this debate of being objective and not activist, etc., etc. And I struggle very hard because sometimes it touches your life, and it's impossible to be impartial in these kind of scenarios, right? In the case of conflicts and war, I have a very strong, how do you say that, like, position, and I do think that journalism should be activist in terms of promoting peace, and human rights, and I think, I know it's very difficult, but as an outlet media, we should put it very clear. I don't know, I was thinking, for example, when we have the example of the minister in Israel saying that the people are, or Palestinians are animals. Hey, as a outlet media, we should talk about this information, but put it clear that this is against the human rights, and it's not because you are journalists and part of the Palestinians, it's because this is against of humanity and the rights of the human rights of people, and it doesn't make you activist. It makes you, it just, you're showing what happens in the world, and
Right.
you're just to have a very clear, I don't know, discourse about what is wrong and what is right. And in this case, it's important to mention, and there's an inherent right of us, all of us, is dignity, and we should be clear about that as a journalist, and it doesn't make you any activist, just a human being.
Yeah, red lines. Anthony, do you want to weigh in on that, or should we go?
I'll just very quickly. We did a study in Kenya, which I think addresses this very question, asked by the Ethiopian journalist, which was, we looked at Kenyan journalists in two significant traumatic events. One was the Al-Shabaab terrorist attack on the Westgate Mall, which was a horrendous event. And the other one was the election violence that took place in Kenya in 2007. And you would have thought beforehand that perhaps the terrorist attack on the Al-Shabaab, by Al-Shabaab, would be the more serious event from a trauma perspective, because these were terrorists that went into a mall and started to kill people. But it wasn't. It was the election violence. And the reason was Kenyan society was starting to fragment along ethnic grounds, and journalists were being targeted based on their ethnicity. And so they would go along to report on a particular story and find themselves sucked into ethnic conflict that they thought had been unimaginable, and they were targeted specifically for their ethnicity. And so that became for them a source of great trauma. And when we looked at lingering post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms, it was not linked to terrorism and Al-Shabaab, bad as it was, but it was to this fracturing of society and the rise of ethnic violence.
Let's give it another go downstairs and see if we're ready to take a question from Christina.
Hi, I'm Christina from the US, and I was wondering if you could speak about the role of personal agency as a protective measure for journalists against distress, especially with this idea of moral agency, whether it's choosing to intervene, choosing how to respond to conflict, or choosing to approach a situation from a solutions journalism perspective, and then how that can be implemented on either a personal level or from a newsroom perspective.
Okay, so I'll just repeat, what is the role of personal agency in protecting journalists?
Would you like me to start?
Yeah, go for it, Anthony.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important. And, your personal agency is also going to be informed by your level of education. So if you know what's out there that's protective, you have a very pivotal role in looking after yourself. From my perspective, as someone who runs a clinical practice and a research unit, I know that you can't foist therapy onto someone. You have to be able to persuade people that therapy is in your own best interests. I believe it's the same for news organizations. You can make therapy available to journalists, but you can't mandate it. I think the moment you start mandating it, you're going to lose the people that you want to help. So you have to win the intellectual argument and persuade people why this is so important. And I think, journalists, once they get educated on this particular topic, that's going to boost the personal agency. They will know what's good for them and what's not good for them. And then they have to be, play an active role in it, as we all do in our lives. We know that, we shouldn't smoke. We shouldn't drink excessively. We should exercise. There's all these kind of things that we should do to keep ourselves well, and it's up to us to do them. We can't be forced to do them. And I think it becomes particularly true of journalists. Educate journalists about what the risk factors are, get them familiar with the concepts of trauma, make the resources available to them, win the intellectual argument that this is very important, that you take this seriously, but ultimately it's going to come down to the individual. Are you going to use it or not?
I'm not going to go downstairs live because we're just having some trouble with the camera down there, but I will ask on behalf of Hang Chao from China. Essentially, it's all well and good to say, well, we could use solutions journalism. What do you do when there is no solution?
I mean, you mean in context, in conflict areas or regions?
For example, or climate change is what she mentioned.
I have to be very clear on that. You won't find maybe initiative about develop initiative there, and something that's really important. I mean, in solution journalism, we try to report on solutions that already are proved, right? And it's very, very hard to find them in the middle of the violence and in the middle of the disaster, natural disasters. So yeah, I completely understand, but you can maybe report on more constructive contents, and in the case of the conflict regions, you can try to seek for more content related to peace initiative, and peace initiative means what I told you before. I know that it's very hard, but anyways, I also think that you can find in the middle of the conflict maybe a solution. I mean, I have done it before, even in Colombia. People, they try to survive and they do everything to survive, and could be, it doesn't have to be a very huge solution. It could be a small one, if it protects communities, if it's, maybe that's worth it now to report on or about. We'll say something like that. But I think you can find them, and there's always a solution, but you have to, search about it, talk to people, talk to locals, to community, to know how can you report about that and how to approach that.
Yeah, I like how Tina Rosenberg says, not every story is going to be a solutions journalism story. No, you can't. That's not how the news works. But if you're not looking for solutions stories, you're not going to see them either. So, yeah. And
actually, I was thinking an example, for example, in Ukraine, there's like 11 centers in the middle of the war, and they were helping people, they receive people and they give them like legal and support and psychological support. And it was in the middle of the conflict, and they arranged that very, 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 very fast. Yeah. And a lot of Ukrainians, journalists report about it, and they are. You have to look at
Sadiq here from Bangladesh wants to know, he'd really be interested in peace journalism in Bangladesh. How does he go about learning more? Where can he find resources, Laura?
There's a lot in internet. There's a lot, and also there are organizations. Maybe you can Google them. One of I don't remember, I'm very bad with names, I'm sorry, but there are a lot of research about it, and also organization in the US. You can find a lot of books and researchers, and there's
any Asia specific organizations on this topic that you can think of? Email me
Exactly. I can email you because I'm very bad.
I'll send it on. No problem at all. I want to, just as we're running out of time, there are a couple of questions that I think are important that we get to. It's a lot easier to retain your humanity when you're dealing with people as individuals. But when you are a journalist, you have to engage with groups and ideologies and politics to get information across succinctly. With conflict, there's a tendency, I've lost my place. But essentially, how do we tell human stories, and how important is humanizing conflict to our emotional well-being? one half of that question is for Anthony and one half is for Laura. Anthony, let me start with you. How important is humanity to well-being?
I think it has to be crucial, because if you lose that, you lose your moral compass.
Mm.
And if you become aware that you've lost it, then it becomes a real source of moral distress.
Mm.
And I've seen it in journalism. I work with them in terms of therapy, and I'll give you practical examples of this. I have worked with a number of very well-known journalists who won a lot of awards.
Mm.
And along the course of a celebrated career, it dawns on them sometimes that the reason they're doing this is more for the awards than for telling the actual story. And when that insight dawns, it becomes a very powerful catalyst for moral injury.
Yeah.
And so I think in terms of, you have to look very carefully at your motivation. Why am I doing this work? What is the purpose of journalism?
Mm.
You are one of the pillars of civil society. And if you lose sight of that, and if you're going to be in it for yourself, and you're chasing something other than that, then you're on a slippery slope to moral injury. And I think that would be the concern over here.
Mm. I want to follow up on that question, Anthony. Not every journalist who goes into a dangerous situation has unresolved issues, but some do. Some who are going into these situations are using those situations to distract from unresolved feelings. How do you interrogate your personal motivations? Where do you begin with that conversation with yourself? And what are some warning signs that you should be looking for mental health support? And then thirdly, what do you do if you can see in the journalist that you're commissioning, these motivations might be harmful? Do you not commission? Is it your right to sit in judgment of someone like that? I don't know. It's so...
That's such a complex, loaded question. I don't know whether we have the time to answer.
Yeah, let's do another.
Other than to say this, I'm acutely aware that me as a psychiatrist cannot tell journalists what to do. And I don't do that. What I can do is present the data and say, this is what the data show. This is what is going to be good. This is what's going to be harmful. These are the things to look out for, to educate people about what the risks are and what the risk factors are. Ultimately, the decision about who goes and covers a war is going to be made by a news organization and the editors, whatever. But they also need to be acutely aware of, what are we dealing with over here? What are the protective factors? What are the risk factors? And so when you're making, such profound decisions, but you're doing it from a point of ignorance, you're going to make mistakes. If you're doing it from a point of greater knowledge, you will reduce the mistakes that you make. And that's why education becomes so important. But, you'll find you can't tell people what to do all the time. You've got to persuade them to do what's in their best interests. Because if you keep on preaching to them, saying, this is bad for you, this is wrong for you, you can't do this, you will lose your constituency.
Absolutely.
Particularly with journalists who are so independent-minded people. So you have to win the argument intellectually. But I think it can be won because the data are so compelling.
Laura, do you want to weigh in?
Yes, I just want to add that I know that we shouldn't tell people what to do, but maybe, I don't know, what I try to do as a journalist, I always ask myself, I try to be very brutal honest with myself. Hey, is this affecting me? How this is affecting me? Is this, I don't know, if I was reporting something or covering something, discovering affecting that much that I'm just, attack myself in doing this? Or should I, how I create the balance? And I have all the questions all the time, like, hey, even being a journalist, like, should I be a journalist? Because I'm just suffering a lot. And you have to be very, very brutal honest. My answer was maybe not, maybe I have to run away. And I ran away. And then I found another ways to report that, make me feel better. And maybe they're not, I think they are not the whole solutions. There are solutions that help me as a person. And we are all different. I know that. But for me, it's really important that journalists start asking themselves, hey, is this affecting me that much? It's so important that I have to cover this rather than my mental health. Like you have to balance, and you have to questions. I don't know, ask yourself these hard questions. Sometimes you will find answers that you won't like, and this is part of the process.
Yeah.
I didn't want to run away from journalism. I adore journalism, but
Yeah.
at some point I had to stop because it wasn't good for me. And also when you make the decision to cover something, ask before go, hey, I'm prepared for this. Will I, handle this amount of suffering? How
Yeah.
can I do that? And if you decide to do it, start from the beginning, creating a space for you and your self-care. That's really, really important. Try to connect all the time with your families, with your colleagues, talk about how are you feeling all the time. Otherwise, it will be a nightmare for you. And also about the response of you were talking how to humanize people. I think that's why all the voices must be heard, and even those that we don't like at all.
Yeah.
And I think we must have the criteria to filter this information and always be very skeptical about the discourses, because of course every party in the conflict, even the victims, has an interest behind them, and it's normal because we are human beings. And I think the important thing as a journalist is to take this interest into account, and also always think that war is not about blacks and whites. And I think nothing in life is actually, but in war you learn more that as a person you have many, many facets. And as a journalist you have to find what are these facets now. And for example, you can be a victim, but at the same time you can be a perpetrator, right? And instead of categorizing people, we should just tell the story of these complexities. This is our duty as a journalist.
That's beautiful. Tell the story of the complexity and not the victim, perpetrator, rescuer. We had a fellow last year who said, I think it was an incredibly simple question, but an incredibly powerful way to begin the self-interrogation. Was Tanmoy from Sanity newsletter on Sanity Substack said, why is it your job to fix that? And why do you think it's you who has to solve this problem? And I just think, hey, it starts there, that answering that question. Why is it your responsibility, Laura, to solve the narco terrorism problem? And the truth is, it's not. It's your job to report information, but it's not your job to solve every part of humanity's ness. So please do join us again next week. We're with our director, Mitali Mukherjee. We'll be talking to Pulitzer and Peabody Prize-winning podcaster Connie Walker about Indigenous affairs coverage. But for this week, a huge thank you for so much of your time, Anthony Feinstein and Laura Dulce Romero. It's been, for me, an incredibly enriching conversation that has literally taken my breath away at points. And I hope it's been beneficial to others. I know there are no easy answers on this topic, but I hope perhaps some of the questions we've asked can start a process. Do either of you want to add anything before we close out?
Thank you for the invitation to be here. Look after yourself, everyone. Be safe.
Yeah, be safe.
Thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
we all send huge admiration for the journalists in Gaza. It's important to mention that. And yeah.
Keep fighting the good fight. Please do. Matt, will you put our email address in the chat so that anyone who wants a preprint of Dr. Feinstein's paper can email us at I think it's Reuters Institute of Politics.oxford.ac.uk, but I'm not sure. But Matt, if you could pop that in the chat, please feel free to send us an email and we will send it back. There it is. And Laura's going to send me some resources for Bangladesh. So
yes, one is the Center for Global Peace Journalism. I remember. Bye-bye.
Guys, have a wonderful Wednesday. See you next week.
Bye-bye.